Alors, je suis très heureuse d'accueillir cet après-midi Chung Daivo qui vient tout spécialement de Hong Kong. Elle nous rejoint de l'Asia Art Archive où elle est chercheuse. Elle dirige les projets de recherche sur l'Asie du Sud-Est à l'Asia Art Archive et ses recherches se concentrent tout particulièrement sur la résistance anticoloniale, sur les circuits d'échange et sur l'historiographie artistique. Tout spécialement l'historiographie artistique moderne, entre guillemets, et contemporaine, entre guillemets. Donc, très sans doute, ce qu'elle veut dire par là, c'est la façon dont ces termes aussi sont créés, existent, circulent dans le langage, avec un focus donc sur le territoire d'Asie du Sud-Est, tel qu'il est défini et représenté tel. Ces publications sont sorties, ces écrits ont été publiés plutôt dans le journal After All, dans de nombreux catalogues d'expositions, que je ne citerai pas toutes, dans des anthologies également. Et elle est anciennement, elle a été Mellon Postdoctoral Fellow au MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, à Boston. Ces recherches portent tout particulièrement aujourd'hui sur le XXe siècle au Vietnam, et je ne vais pas reprendre son résumé entièrement, mais sachez simplement qu'une des questions qu'elle pose est sur le colonialisme français, comment il a été institué par justement ces écoles d'art, et comment les étudiants vietnamiens, étudiants et futurs artistes, ont propagé, approprié et défié, challengé, pour utiliser un anglicisme, les principes qui, justement, ont été véhiculés par les écoles d'art. Pour clore la journée, je suis très heureuse d'accueillir Laetitia Decchini, qui est chargée de recherche, comme vous le savez, au CNRS, chercheuse associée au CIAS. Elle est auteure de nombreuses publications. Je cite tout particulièrement des publications qui ont eu un impact pour moi, pour mes propres recherches, pour celles, je pense, d'autres personnes dans la salle. Un livre notamment sur Arun Kotlakar et la littérature moderne en Inde, publié chez Bloomsbury en 2004 et republié, réédité en 2016. Mais aussi, je mentionnerai le double numéro spécial de la revue The Worlds of Bombay Poetry, qu'elle coédite en 2017. C'est un double numéro, je vais la citer, je vais la résumer en anglais. It's a special issue geared towards the larger cultural, linguistic, publishing and creative background against which we can read poets in English and in Marathi, and towards the deep symbiotic culture between poets, visual and graphic artists, publishers, filmmakers or musicians in the 50s and up to the 70s. Donc la raison pour laquelle elle est présente ici aujourd'hui, c'est tout particulièrement, entre autres, avenues de recherche qui sont présentes dans son travail, pour rappeler ces ponts, rappeler la diversité de ces milieux culturels et aussi évidemment d'un point de vue théorique des nombreux liens entre mondialisation en art et en littérature. Merci beaucoup de les accueillir. Je cite également, car elle m'a demandé de le faire, je pense que c'est important de rappeler ce projet avant de terminer, le projet AHRC du Arts and Humanities Research Council, soutenu donc par le AHRC, auquel fait partie et dirige Laetitia Decchini, qui s'intitule The Impact of Non-Governmental Writers Organizations on Free Expression. Voilà, je cède maintenant la parole à Chung Daivo. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Devika. I'd like to thank Devika for bringing me back here, and to Zahia for letting me know about the Victor Tardo archive, which I will plow through next summer. So the research that I am presenting here resonates with Partha's research on the colonial distinction between art and craft, except in this context it would be the French Colonial Era in Indochina. And I think it also is a good segue to Zahia's presentation and the last question from the last panel. So what I'll do is I'll kind of give a survey of the schools that the French opened at the beginning of the 20th century, and then the second half of the talk will look at some examples of the works of students who graduated from the schools. I feel as though the first few slides are echo the beginning of the presentation, because I also have various maps. Yeah, sometimes people don't know where Vietnam is, so I always have a map of Vietnam first. And it's the S-shaped country. And as you know, the French named it, that region, Indochina, because they were looking for a trade route between India and China. And so out of the French imagination, you had an entity called Indochina. I'd like to just start first by putting forward the argument that Vietnam, as we know it today, is a very recent phenomenon, and that's important, not so much for this presentation, but for the larger project that I'm doing, where I'm looking at Vietnamese modernisms, and I'm tracing two genealogies. The first is the modernism that comes out of Hanoi, which we know as socialist realism, and that's the art history that you normally would see if you read art history sources in English and in French, and also the Vietnamese nationalist historiography. The other genealogy that I'm trying to trace is the one that comes out of Saigon, and that one is more aligned with the French modernisms. And that one, there's a lot of use of the word internationalism in the Vietnamese language sources that I've come across. So Vietnam, as we know it today, didn't really exist as a country until 1975. So as you see here, from the 11th to the 18th century, you had a movement called Nam Tien, which means southward expansion. And so in Hanoi, there was a rivalry between two very powerful families. And one family stayed in the north, and then the other family moved south. And as they moved south, they started conquering the various other kingdoms. And among those kingdoms was the Jampa kingdom in the central region. That was a Hindu-Muslim kingdom. And then the blue area you see is the Anchor Kingdom. And so what we now know as southern Vietnam, parts of it are from the Anchor Kingdom. And so the first dynasty of the expanded Vietnamese nation state was the Nguyen dynasty, which was founded in 1802. And the first emperor was Nguyen Phuc Anh, who took the royal name Ya Long. And as you know, he was able to beat his rivals with help from the French. Right. And so it was with that the French had made inroads into the dynasty, and within half a century, had annexed what we know as Vietnam, and had partitioned that area into three parts: Tonkin, Annam, and Cochin China, and then later also Laos and Cambodia, and the five entities became Indochina. Right. But then that also falls apart between 1945 and 1954, when you had the partition of the country into North and South Vietnam. Right? And so, again, my argument is that what you see as Vietnam is really only about 40, 50 years in existence. And I think that's very important to emphasize, because the genealogy of the South has really been erased in the Vietnamese nationalist historiography, but also in Western historiography, which tends to think about Vietnamese history and resistance as an anti-imperial war of liberation, but that itself ignores the fact that this was also a civil war, and that in the ensuing civil war, South Vietnam and its history becomes marginalized and oftentimes erased. And that's, both discursively but also physically, because a lot of the public art, for example, in South Vietnam will be destroyed after 1975. And in terms of historiography, that also means that a lot of the material from the South was systematically destroyed. both by people from the north who came south, but also by artists and scholars in the south who were afraid that the material that they had would implicate them in terms of an alignment with the South Vietnamese government. And so it's very difficult to do research on that region. Okay. So I'll go back to the early 20th century. As you can see from this map, and I think also some of the images that Zahia has shown, Indochina was very much seen as a land of natural resources. Right? And so here you have wood and elephants and agriculture and other things. And I think that's very important in terms of thinking about what art schools get opened during the French colonial time. So these schools, there were 4, maybe 5 vocational schools that were set up, and then there was also the College of Fine Arts that was set up. And they were part of the mission civilisatrice, the idea that Southeast Asia was this ancient land, and the natives had let their heritage go to ruins, and they didn't know how to preserve it, and it was the burden of the Europeans to teach them in the ways of civilization and how to salvage their ruins. Okay. So before the French came, there was not the concept of the artists versus the craftsmen. Right? So that distinction becomes institutionalized through the schools that the French set up. And then the other thing that was the norm was that, and this goes back to Partha's presentation where he talked about patronage. In the Vietnamese context, the patronage was from the Vietnamese royal family, the court, and also the high mandarins. And so it was the court that would employ artisans and craftsmen for anywhere from 5 to 6 months out of the year, and they that number of artisans was up to 80,000. Right? And so the royal family was a very important source of income and arts promotion. Yeah, but that source of patronage dwindles during the French colonial time, and one of the most significant events was the 1862 treaty with France. So the French demanded heavy reparations from the Wing court, and in order to pay those reparations, the Wing court reduced the number of artisans that they commissioned to the point where by the 1900s there were a lot of laborers who could not do that work anymore, right? And so they had to turn to other occupations. Right? So one of the crafts or artistic lineages that had developed in Vietnam was lacquer. Right? So lacquer as a painting medium was taught in the French school, but before that, as you can see, lacquer itself was a part of the artistic work at the royal court. And you see it in the sculpture, you see it in the architecture, and you see it on the walls. And what's interesting is that you don't see it as something that where the separation between utility and something where art for art's sake is not seen in these settings. Right? So these trades or these skills would eventually get lost. You know, another example was this huge set of 9 dynastic urns made of bronze, and they were all made of, out of one set, one casting, right? So it's not pieces that were put together, but it's just one melting. And the reason art historians know that is because they have not discovered any seams. Right? And so these kinds of skills get lost by the time that you have the art schools instituted. Right. So the The other parallel phenomenon that you start seeing is the shift in consumption from the domestic market to the export market. Right? So there were several art traditions in Vietnam that the French admired, and they started seeing those as sources of commodity work that could be transported to the European bourgeois market. And it's out of that that they start actually formalizing those skills and opening 4, maybe 5 vocational schools. So in 1901, you have the carpentry school that opens in Ben Nhung in the north. In 1902, there's a vocational school in Hanoi. I think that's the Dong Ho printmaking school. I'm trying to find more sources on that. 1903, you have the School of Applied Arts in Binh Hoa, which is about 20 kilometers northeast of Saigon. And then in 1913, you have the Drawing School, which opens in Yadin, which now is a part of Saigon. And so you'll notice that it's actually not until 1925 that you have the College of Fine Arts that's open. Right, and so the vocational schools are the ones that get opened first. I'm going to talk very briefly about the School of Drawing and the Indochina College of Fine Arts. So the drawing school opened in demand for people who could draw for the newspapers, because with the French there was a huge boom in journalism and the press. And so a lot of the drawings and reproductions of paintings that you see in the Vietnamese newspapers were drawn by students who came out of the Yadin drawing school. It became so popular that from its opening in 1913 with 15 students, by 1943 you had 160 students. And they were taught not only drawing, but they're also taught courses in tempera, lacquer, oil, and silk painting. And so it expands into a full-fledged painting school itself. And this school would later get incorporated in the second half of the 19th century into what we now know as the Ho Chi Minh University of Fine Arts. The other school that opens in the south is the School of Applied Arts in Binh Hoa. It still exists. Now it's known as the Dong Nai College of Decorative Arts. And that school became famous in the 1940s under the direction of Robert Balloch and his wife, Mariette Balloch. So she actually had a huge influence on the school, even though she was a lecturer rather than the director, because of her training at Limoges. So the School of Binh Hoa is about 20 kilometers northeast of Saigon, and it was built on this area called Gai Mai, and that area is very famous for its mud and its clay. And Chinese migrants had migrated to that region in the 1600s during the Civil War in China. And so with that migration, there were Chinese craftsmen who came south, and they were really interested in the mud. And so out of that, they combined their skills with the skills of the Jampa and the Khmer craftsmen in that region. And they made what became known as the Binh Hoa ceramics tradition. And then when the French came, especially with Mariette, she started experimenting with her students in different glazes and different ways of firing. And out of that, the most famous glaze is the one that you see in the middle here, which became known as the Verre de Binh Hoa. And these ceramics became so popular in the European middle class commodity market that you start seeing this circulating, and you see this in some of the museums in Europe, and actually at the Albert and Victoria Museum. When I was there last year, I saw a lot of these ceramics there. So the other school is the the School of Fine Arts in Hanoi, which opens in 1925. And as we know, the first director was Victor Tardeau, and he won the Indochina Prize in 1920, and like Gauguin, he was drawn to the tropics, right? And so in his case, it was to Indochina. And so he went there in 1921, and when he was there, he met Nam Sang, right? And so you saw a picture of Nam Sang in Zahia's presentation. And so he made it possible for Nam Sang was a self-taught artist who had studied Chinese ideograms. And so when he met Victor Tardeau, Tardeau sent him to France to study for a year. So some sources I've read say it was in the 1920s, and other sources say it was in the 1930s. And so I need to figure out which source is what. But we do know that he did go to Paris, and then he came back, and the two of them opened this school. So Tardeau was the director from 25 to 1937. Right? Before he opened the school, Victor Tardeau had several commissions, and one of them, when he came to Vietnam, he was commissioned to paint this huge fresco mirror for the Grand Amphitheater at the Indo-Chinese University. Right? And so you see this is a 77 square meter fresco, and it's an example of neoclassicism. And so you see here how the school's curriculum, stems from his training. You had a lot. The students were trained from live models. They were also trained to draw patterns of what were codified as traditional Indo-Chinese motifs. And so the idea of traditional motifs actually comes from the teachers going to the temples, and they started seeing certain types of motifs, and they chose certain motifs that they codified as traditional, and then those students were taught to repeat these patterns over and over again. Right. And what's interesting is that this exercise in drawing what the French teachers determined were tradition, that becomes a way in which ideas about local practices get defined as craft. And then what gets defined as art is synonymous with European oil painting. So this is an example of a painting by Nam Sang, the co-founder of the Indo-Chinese College of Fine Arts. Two other teachers at the school was Évariste Jansur, who became the director in 1938, and he introduced applied arts courses. What's interesting is that because during the dynastic times when patronage from the court was the main source of income for artists and artisans, you didn't have this idea of traditional patterns, right? And so art was made for everyday use, whereas during the French colonial time, art was made to be something put on a wall or on a pedestal. And so the average Vietnamese patron was very alienated from these works that were made. And so what the students made, they couldn't sell. Right? But then, because of their training, they were taught that these things that they were making was what was art. And so when the second director introduced applied art courses, actually the utility aspect of that, the students themselves rejected, right, because they saw that as inferior. And some of them even actually hated that there were these courses being offered at the school. Okay. Joseph Ungberti was another teacher, another French teacher who taught there, And what's interesting about him is that he, when he was there, went to a lot of the temples and he observed the use of lacquer. And so it was he who brought lacquer into the curriculum, which I find so interesting. That's something that Vietnamese were practicing for many decades before the French come, actually gets put into the French school and gets defined as something French. But what is interesting is that within the school, lacquer itself becomes a medium for painting. Right? And so if you study Vietnamese art history, you have to study lacquer painting. It's one of the major mediums even today. And the students in the school actually made amazing innovations with lacquer. And so one of the most famous of those is Tri, who was among the first cohorts who graduated from the school. You know, he is known for these huge lacquer paintings, and they're usually of young women, you know, with very sinuous forms, and they oftentimes represent or symbolize the seasons, whether it's summer or spring. And here, so you see his training in the French academic style, but then what is interesting is that his innovations expand the possibility of lacquer. And so lacquer before was a very limited palette, mostly in black, brown, and white. And you see Tri and his peers experimenting, and they expand the palette so that there is gold, and here you also see red, and you also see blue. Right? And lacquer, if you know it, is a very difficult medium because it takes a long time, and it's a perfect medium that combines the so-called skills of the craftsman and the artist. Because in order to make a lacquer painting, you have to know how to make the base first. And so it's layer upon layer of cloth, and you have to wait for each layer to dry, and then you apply the next one, and then you have to sand it down. And then after that, you have to learn how to embed the colors into the base. Another famous painter who is among the first cohorts is Le Faux, and actually most of his paintings are in private collections in France. And the reason for that is that he eventually settles in Paris, and so that's why the collections are here. He is known for his silk paintings, right? And so here you see again the sinuous bourgeois ladies who are always in these settings of comfort, and they're usually playing a musical instrument or reading poetry or leisurely reclining. Another famous artist is Dan Van Gang, and this is one of his most famous paintings. This is in the Museum of Fine Arts in Hanoi. It's Am Thuy. The reason I'm showing you these is because they're all portraits, right? And so like Partha had mentioned, in the Vietnamese context, you also have those three main genres. You know, you have the portrait, the landscape, and the history painting. Right? But then later on, you will start seeing the decline of the portrait because that was seen as individualistic and bourgeois. Right? So the School of Fine Arts in Indochina during World War II, it eventually closes in 1945 during the bombing, and then the school has to disperse. And in 1950, the school, there's a group of students who go into the forest, and It's then that Tố Ngọc Vang becomes the director. So if you remember, he is the person who, I haven't shown him yet. Okay. So this is one of his most famous paintings. So again, you see the bourgeois lady in recline, and there's the implication of a very sexualized representation of beauty. This is 1943. So if you see, his style will evolve, where by 1946 he's involved in the anti-French resistance movement. And so this is a painting, a personification of Hanoi rising. Right? So Hanoi vùng đứng lên, so Hanoi rises. And here you still see that very romantic gestural representation of the woman. But by 1954, you start seeing a very different style from the same artist. So you still see the training in the representation of the body, but here the palette is more somber. You also see no more representations of the bourgeois character, but it's the peasant, the soldier, and the proletariat. Okay. So if you remember, 54 is the battle at Dien Bien Phu, when the French are defeated by a coalition of Vietnamese forces. So Nguyen Sang is another famous lacquer painter. So here also in 1954, you see a representation that supports the anti-French colonial resistance. But here what's interesting is that lacquer painting, which was developed during the French colonial time, becomes a tool that is favored by the Viet Minh forces. And the reason for that is because lacquer is seen as an indigenous medium. And so that becomes something that is promoted. But that is not always the case, because lacquer, since it's a very labor-intensive medium, it also gets criticized as something that is wasteful, right? And so you see these debates in the periodicals in the 40s and 50s, and you see artists who argue against lacquer painting, and they argue for something more simple, such as watercolor, some mediums that don't require a lot of material and that also are mobile. Because this is a time when artists are in the armed forces and they're also traveling, and so they need material that they can take with them easily, and lacquer is not something that you can take with you. Okay. So Nguyen Sang, the same artist, by 1963, he's still making a lot of representations of soldiers. Right? And so here you see, when it's people, they're usually in groups. Right? It's very rare at this time to see individual portraits anymore. Nguyen Tư Nghiêm is another famous lacquer painter, and again, it's a group, but what is interesting is it's not the bulky bodies that you normally see associated with socialist realism. Right. Dan Van Kang, who had made this famous woodblock print, this is 1943. By 1958, you see here a representation of peasants who are frolicking in the countryside, right? And so these types of paintings were supposed to be for a moral uplift, right? And so it's the utopia of the revolution. Right? Another artist is Bui Sung Phai. So Bui Sung Phai is interesting because he was also among the first cohorts of the Indochina College of Fine Arts. But when the school disbands and moves into the forest, he doesn't go, he stays in Hanoi, and he actually continues to paint the style. And so you see this through the 70s and 80s, and he's one of those artists who is ostracized eventually because he doesn't follow the socialist realist school. Those artists that I show you, they mostly have stayed in the north. The artists who moved south after 1954, their work is much more difficult to find. Like I said, because a lot of that work, the paper traces were destroyed. But one of the artists I'm trying to find material on is Wing Yatri, so the lacquer painter, and he had moved after 1954, and he eventually becomes the director of the School of Applied Arts. And so I'm trying to find how the school evolved under his directorship. And then the other artist who was very famous, who also moved south, is Tate. And here you see the French influence with Cubism, and so it's in the south that you still see this alignment with Impressionism, Post-Impressionism, Fauvism, Cubism, Surrealism, and that becomes known as a particular type of internationalism. All right, I'm going to end there.
Thank you very much.